is Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 15th, 2024, and I'm J.D. Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. The question on everyone's mind: is Longlegs the scariest movie of all time? Because that's all that matters. Is it the
Marketing,
scariest
baby.
film of all time?
Marketing,
if not,
baby.
Get out of my face.
If it's not, that means the movie sucks.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
There is
that's what the
only
marketing goal is.
one barometer for success if you're a horror film or any kind of film. Are you scary? Because if you're not scary, you're not good.
I've seen a lot of
There
scary
it is.
movies, both this year and years before, that weren't even horror movies that I would say were scarier than Longlegs. I'll simply say that.
Yeah, well, you know. it
Scary in different
turns out-
ways. I mean, Madam Web
Yeah.
was scary.
Madam Web was scary. You're absolutely right. But it turns out that if you can't provoke a jump scare, or I don't know how people are defining scary. I assume that's what they mean, but who knows?
That's the conventional scare, right? That's what
Yeah.
people tend to latch onto when it comes to the classic mantra of horror movie tactics. It's the jump scare tends to rank top of the list. And I know jump scares are very they're very particular for certain horror audiences. Some people like them, some people don't. They could be utilized effectively. I mean, we talked about jump scares being utilized very effectively earlier this year in horror movies like The First Omen, right? There
Yeah.
are sequences there that are jump scare-like, but are used very creatively. I don't think we're going to be talking much about jump scares when it comes to Longlegs, though. It's
No.
a very different type of beast.
Well, and that's why I perhaps pose that as a theory as to why some are not being scared by this movie, we shall say, or as others
Yeah.
have put it on social media, they've been bored to tears. And look, I'm not saying that you don't have to like the movie. That's perfectly understandable. There are things to criticize about Longlegs, but why does everything have to live in the extremes and in a black and white duality?
Well,
That's what I want to know. Like, why does this have to be the scariest film of all time? But maybe that does point back to marketing and people's expectations.
I was gonna say the marketing here definitely had that as part of their MO in some ways. So by putting it in there, does that mean they're inviting that as a valid criticism? And I'm not saying they do. I
Maybe.
think it's a valid question because of those circumstances. To say the movie didn't scare you in the way that the movie trailers and the promos promised, is that then a fair criticism and maybe more emblematic as to why this now holds a C+ rating on CinemaScore or something like that? I think there is a valid question there, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I mean, marketing does influence perception, and your expectations might be based off of that. I have absolutely no qualms with that. Everyone probably came into Longlegs based off of the marketing and what they saw and what they expected. But if you can't separate the art from the marketing, that's a big problem.
That's another conversation.
That's a
there.
big problem.
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in some ways, because it definitely goes to show, on one hand, the marketing might be inviting that as a potential criticism, but on the other hand, you're right. Are there audiences that are too, I guess, myopic in their viewpoints and how they want to perceive horror, especially? Like, it is a genre that is so difficult to really please everybody, which makes it one of the more fascinating genres. But there is a perception there that maybe needs to be changed in order to make horror movies a bit more successful, especially more art house films.
For sure. And that's, it's a double-edged sword that can go both ways.
Right.
I can't recall which film it was. I feel like recently we had this conversation about expectations walking into some film and it surprises you, and that's always an exciting feeling. But the surprise factor, even on the positive end of the spectrum, can only take a film so far. Citizen Kane is not hailed as a masterpiece because it surprised a few folks. That's just not the case. Like Oppenheimer doesn't garner the reputation it does because it surprised a few people. At a certain point, it's the film. Like, it's the artistry,
novelty
it's
wears
the
off.
Quality. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, the surprise factor is great. I love it as well. It's a category for us at the In-Session Film Awards at the end of the year. Like I love that about film and art and the experience, but that doesn't define, especially over time.
I think
it doesn't
you're
define
right.
a movie.
I think every movie that is very surprising, especially in the positive end. We talked about The First Omen just a few moments ago, but that is a huge qualifier for best surprise movie of the year. I mean, no one expected that to be as good as it was, but I think all surprise movies in that way require a rewatch when that novelty has worn off, because then it allows you to see it as a movie. And I'm really interested to rewatch something like The First Omen. Does that hold up as a movie, or was the surprise novelty the thing that really drove us to positive? I mean, I don't think it was.
I don't think so either. I think that is
there are
a
examples
good movie.
where it could fall into that category, though.
For sure. Absolutely. And I think that's why, even on the other end, flipping the finger, I guess, pointing it back at Longlegs. I mean, even if you walk in and you feel disappointed, like, that same feeling can dissipate over time.
Yeah.
And you can look at a movie and judge it for what it actually is.
Exactly.
And ultimately, I think that's why you have to separate the marketing at a certain point. It's going to influence expectation. That's what marketing is all about.
Well, it's, I mean, the marketing did a great job influencing people who arrive at the theater for this one. We'll talk more about it on the main show, but Neon had a big hit here. Neon had a huge hit with Longlegs.
Exactly. We're all looking forward to Gladiator 2, but the trailer or the marketing, the images of Paul Mescal shirtless, that won't define the film's quality. Okay,
it'll define the film's attendance opening weekend.
Exactly, that's it.
Because the question here is, if I have to make a bit of a pun here, and I have to do it, will Longlegs have long enough legs to carry over into the next weekend? That's the question. So this will be a fascinating conversation when it comes to box office in a week from now.
For sure, which we'll get to on the main show this week. At any rate, we're here to talk about Longlegs, the movie, not so much the marketing or anyone's expectations going in. I guess the only thing from my end on that front, I know you and I are a little mixed on Osgood Perkins as a filmmaker. I was anticipating this film mostly because there was positive word of mouth, and it seemed as if there was a lot of highly anticipated folks looking forward to this.
Yeah.
And the immediate buzz from those earlier reviews were mostly positive.
Yeah.
So, that got my attention for sure. Outside of that, I couldn't say that it was one of my most anticipated films of the summer or anything to that effect.
But I think the thing that got me most excited was certainly the word of mouth and all of that, and as well as the cast, which we'll certainly talk about when we dive into the review, but also just the style of it. The fact that we're getting a 90s style serial killer thriller that also takes place in the 90s. There's a lot of word of mouth that we'll also talk about with regard to this film and how it's, I don't want to say stealing, but it certainly wears its influences on its sleeve. We'll say that. But at the same time, there might be something kind of like the novelty of that might be kind of neat. That like there is almost like a nostalgia factor at play here that we don't tend to get these kind of like raw and rotten serial killer movies, that were so famous in the 90s. I think that's a really neat thing. And that's why I was actually at least looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think with that, let's go ahead and jump into this thing. Longlegs is written and directed by Osgood Perkins, and it stars Micah Monroe, Nicolas Cage. Oh my goodness. Blair Underwood, Alicia Witt, Michelle Choi Lee, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Longlegs, in pursuit of a serial killer, an FBI agent uncovers a series of occult clues that she must solve to end his terrifying killing spree. I have maybe a thought on that synopsis alone. I think there's
Yeah.
some levity there. Weirdly, I kind of want to chuckle at that synopsis, but I don't want to give away why that's the case at this point in the
I'm
conversation.
curious about that. Levity is going to be a strong
So-
point in my thoughts as well.
Maybe we'll get to that as this conversation goes. Brendan, what did you think about Longlegs?
Admittedly, I am still wrestling with this one. I'm very interested to see how this conversation goes because I mean, having sat with it for as long as I have and hearing the positive word of mouth from some of our fellow critics, as well as some of the negative word of mouth that exists right now, not just from those audiences that we talked about in the opening that were quote unquote not scared enough by this thing, but a lot of our friends have legitimate criticisms of the film itself as far as how it's functioning as a story, as a narrative, as a thematic exercise, whatever it might be. And we'll certainly talk about that. And those are the things that I'm still wrestling with as far as what it might be going for. I will say at this point now, given Osgood Perkins and his filmography, of course, Osgood Perkins being the son of Anthony Perkins of Psycho fame, we
course,
should also
yes.
note that. So it's certainly in the blood, right?
Yeah,
I
and this film
including-
is very personal to him as far as his family is concerned. If you know
Yeah.
the history there, it's fascinating.
Yeah, we might talk about that as well if we're talking about the same thing. But Osgood Perkins has directed 4 films thus far, including Longlegs. I've seen 3 of them. The other 2 being The Black Coat's Daughter and Gretel and Hansel. I haven't seen, what's it called? I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, I think it's called. I have not
Yes,
seen that one. But of the 3 that I have seen, I think I'm at a point where I might just have to accept that Oz Perkins is not really one of my guys. There's a lot about Longlegs that I can admire, and the big thing being, it does feel genuinely evil. I genuinely believed after coming out of the theater that the person who made this is perhaps a Satanist in real life. Like it has a tone to it. It has a really mean and evil quality that I kind of admire. Like I have to admire how heavy it is in that regard. That might be simultaneously my criticism of the film, because when I think about some of his other films, especially something like The Black Coat's Daughter, I often wonder if his craft just suffocates the experience for me. There's something about his films that they're well made. The craft is always there. The question for me becomes, is it possible that it could also be too good? And I think that's kind of the case with Longlegs for me. There are things about this movie that I really wanted to latch onto, most notably Micah Monroe, who I think is giving a very interesting performance. There are so many things as far as Perkins's direction is concerned that kept putting me at an arm's length from the other things I was trying to get at underneath. And it made the film feel kind of hollow for me. And
Okay.
this is where I'm really wrestling with it. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on it. But I sometimes wonder if his films, Perkins specifically, are just simply over-directed. Because there are good things here. The craft is there. I just found myself maybe more distracted by them than I was genuinely affected by them in the way of trying to find this synergy between tactic and story, if that makes sense. In a way, it does feel like it's overly tactical and less emotionally driven. That bothered me a little bit as to why I can't say I love this thing, but I love the way it made me feel. I felt like I felt like I needed to be baptized after watching this. And that's a huge praise I can at least give it, that I think deserves some recognition there.
Yeah, I think on the whole, I did like the film. I was convinced by what it was aiming for, but I didn't quite wholly go for it. I can't fully wrap my arms around this film, but it is one of the most unsettling films in recent memory in terms of its aesthetic and unnerving atmosphere. I really, with every fiber of my being, do not care if it is or isn't the scariest film of all time. It really does not matter. The film's
Hmm.
ambiance is unrelentingly creepy and off putting. It
Hmm.
burrows under your skin, and it's extremely effective in that regard. It's not
Sure.
trying to scare in the traditional sense, as we talked about earlier. One of its biggest strengths is that it isn't reliant on jump scares and cheap thrill. Most of its
Hmm.
terror manifests by evoking an eerie sense of unsettling dread at every turn
Hmm.
and the nightmare fuel that is Nicolas Cage's performance. And that, I think, is the most potent kind of horror. It's the
Sure.
daunting feeling of being thrust into some sort of paranoia and paralysis. And as a result, there are some deeply troubling scenes in this film. That opening sequence, for example, sent chills down my spine.
The
I
opening
think
sequence is genuinely great, and it's not
it's
even
so
just the
good.
the sequence itself; it's the editing of it.
Oh my
I
gosh.
will say
Yeah.
that's the one
It's
moment
chilling.
where I genuinely felt that there was a real synergy between story and scare, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I felt like before the title card even drops, that moment is where everything really
Oh
came
my
together
gosh.
for me.
Absolutely. I completely agree in terms of setting the tone, in terms
Mhm.
of its ominous morbidity. I mean, it
Sure.
does that immaculately.
Yeah.
So Perkins's direction and craft here, I think, is quite notable.
Mhm.
Quite notable. And how people aren't being affected by that, I don't. I can't
Well,
relate with you. I'm
it's
sorry.
not
I just
traditional.
can't.
It's not traditional. Like
Yeah.
he's very much, looking at the classic Alfred Hitchcock mantra of the scare of a bomb going off underneath the table or a bomb not going off, and how the latter is so much more frightening because it creates suspense. Instead, Osgood Perkins will linger on open doorways for long periods of time and basically not do a darn thing with them. He's more about creating a sensation than he is delivering the payoff. And
Mm.
some people find that more thrilling. Some people don't. But I'm kind of with you. That's usually a tactic I like more because it kind of keeps you, it almost brings you in as an audience member, like you're weirdly part of the story. And there are times he kind of does that, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think as far as his camera work goes, the score here, which I think is very good as well,
Hmm.
and again, the way he manifests this daunting atmosphere throughout the film, it is incredibly robust.
Hmm.
It's fantastic. Now that said, I do think his storytelling is where the film lacks. It doesn't quite
Okay.
have the same vigor. It is derivative. It doesn't seem to have too much to say. It's
Hmm.
not quite as jumbled as something like Maxine, but I'm not sure if the cynicism adds up to anything. But it still won me over in the end, though, with how it flips the police procedural formula on its head. I certainly want to talk about that more as
Hmm.
we go here. And I guess to bring it full circle, I think that's where comparison can be troublesome, especially
Yeah.
with this film, because films like Silence of the Lambs, Zodiac, Seven, for example, which you've seen a lot of in a ton of reviews, I think those are a little misguided in this instance. They're clearly an influence to some degree, for sure. But
Yeah.
in the end, this film is a totally different experience. This is why I struggle with comparison as a critical tool. Comparison is fine when it's done in good faith and has a specific purpose, but tossing out superficial similarities for the sake of it is meaningless. I don't know what that accomplishes. And that's kind of what it feels like to me when you invoke
Hmm.
those kinds of movies. And even worse, some of the criticisms seem to be rooted in the idea of, well, Longlegs isn't nearly as good as Zodiac. Seven is just a way better film.
Very little films
Okay,
are as good as those, though.
sure. Again, I don't know if that accomplishes anything. That just makes the conversation very limiting, I think. I agree, this film isn't as good as Zodiac or Silence of the Lambs, but it's still unsettling, deeply alarming in its atmosphere. The performances are very good. I love the camera work. There are good things here. Again, not everything is black and white. And I think it's perfectly okay for a film to be in the middle. A lot of films fall into this middle ground, and we don't have to live in a world of extremes. So yeah, not many films are going to reach the heights of a Zodiac or Silence of the Lambs, or maybe even Seven if you hold that in high regard. But this film has good things to offer. It doesn't quite get there in the end because of the storytelling, which we can talk about. It does have its blemishes, but as an experience, especially a theatrical one at that, man, this film I thought was gratifying from that perspective.
Yeah. Admittedly, I did go into this film knowing that some people have been drawing comparisons to movies like The Silence of the Lambs and Seven and Zodiac. And there are things in the narrative here that are reminiscent of those films, but tonally, I never really sensed a similarity between them.
Yeah.
I felt like Longlegs more or less had its own, I guess, tonal identity. I will say, though,
Yes.
the movie it did remind me of, and I have seen a few other people call this out, and it's a movie we sort of talked about not too long ago when we did our 2001 retrospective last year. I had a movie called Cure, the Kiyoshi Kurosawa film.
Sure. Yeah.
And like, it actually made me realize that there's a lot here in Longlegs that I feel like is drawing from South Korean horror. Like there are some similarities there.
Okay.
If there is any comparison to make that I think maybe has more validity than saying this is yet another Silence of the Lambs, I would say the South Korean horror movement, maybe this has a little bit more of a comparison to, or even Japanese horror, as you know, Cure is a Japanese film.
Sure.
It has more of that Asian aesthetic, I feel like, even though this is an American film. It's so interesting because I feel like maybe our biggest disparity here mostly comes down to Osgood Perkins. I'm also willing to agree that there might be, not even might be, there are some blemishes here in the narrative. But I can both praise and criticize Osgood Perkins's direction here. I mentioned the example earlier of how he'll linger on things like an open door in the background, and it makes you as an audience member wondering when someone may peek through and watch this person, or if someone is there watching this character this whole time. So it adds a sense of paranoia. At times, though, it goes on for so long to the point that I just got so distracted by those tactics, and I just wanted to get a little bit more of the character that was the subject of that tactic, if that makes sense. Because there's a lot going on here with Michael Monroe's performance that I do think is genuinely fascinating. We get a lot of backstory with her, but we don't really get a lot of answers as to why she is so reserved in the way that she is. Like there almost is this like this hidden subtext of autism at play here or something like that I've heard some people call out, so I can't take credit for that. But I think that makes it a really fascinating character to dissect even further. And I think Perkins, as great as his craft is, it also sometimes just got in the way for me. In a weird way, it kind of reminded me of remember Scream 5? And remember there's a sequence in that movie where Dylan Minnette is going through his house before he's killed off, and he's opening refrigerators, he's opening other doors, and it's building up this moment that something's going to happen, then it doesn't. Oh, and then it does it again, but then it doesn't. Oh, but then it does it again, then it doesn't. And then it finally happens and delivers the thrill. It keeps building up, but it goes on for like 20 minutes. That's sort of how I felt here with Perkins's direction. I really felt the puppeteering a little bit too much, and there's an emotionality here that I think could work, and there are just things that got in the way for me, unfortunately.
Yeah, I do not agree with that perspective, or at least that wasn't my experience with this film. I will say though, those tactics you're talking about, they are absolutely here for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think that Osgood Perkins is manipulating in any stretch of the imagination. I think a lot of these lingering shots or these camera pans, these zooms that we get are tools that he utilizes to influence or heighten again the creep factor and in creating this ominous atmosphere that there is something dark at play that could be around, and we know that spiritually there is this lingering presence that is haunting the Lee Harker character throughout this film. So I do love that there's this invisible hand at play that that I think does a great job in terms of at least creating tension and atmosphere without, again, relying on conventional horror tactics. There are no jump scares. There's never really a moment where, because to your point about Scream 5, the whole point of that is we're building up tension because we're going to eventually go to some sort of conventional hollow thrill.
Yeah.
And that's what it's building up to. This film is doing the complete antithesis. It's not building up to a jump scare. It's not building up to some sort of hollow thrill. All it wants to do is create a lingering tension to add to its atmosphere.
Right, yeah.
And those lingering shots, and I guess to your parallels to Alfred Hitchcock and The Bomb, that's really all that he's doing with those with the camera and letting it linger the way it does. It is inviting us into a world that is disturbing, that is unsettling. And when you couple that with the spiritualism at play, I'll say vaguely for now, I think it is very effective in heightening those chilling tones and what could be out there lingering as this spiritual entity. So that I did find extremely effective, and I was equally drawn into those moments because you do wonder if there is something there, and there, well, I guess I don't want to give it away, but through a lot of the film there isn't a payoff until there is in the third act. There's two scenes that come to mind for me where there is a payoff, but again, that payoff doesn't come in. Oh, I'm going to open the fridge and there's a guy there.
No.
Oh, we never saw.
And I should clarify, my Scream 5 comparison is not meant to be apples to apples.
No,
if anything,
sure.
Yeah, it's almost, I guess maybe an even better comparison. Again, not apples to apples, but let's say we go back to 2018 to that first A Quiet Place film. There's a shot of a nail on a stairwell, okay?
Yeah.
And we know that's going to come into fruition again at some point down the line. And then the next scene is John Krasinski and his son by the water, and they're having a very tender moment. And in that moment, I was sitting there thinking, I can't even latch on to this emotional moment because I just keep thinking about that stinking nail. And again, it has a very different payoff. It's not the same thing as Longlegs, but in the process of getting to whatever conclusion it was arriving at, I was still distracted in similar ways. So I'm thinking, okay, like, there are things that Micah Monroe is doing in her performance that I do find compelling. Stop showing me the stupid door. It's like it's things like that.
Well,
it's like,
and
I guess it's effective, but maybe it's too effective for me is the best way to put it.
Okay. And I guess the difference for us is, with something like A Quiet Place, there's a tangible item that the film is lingering on. There's an actual bomb. There's no bomb in this film. There's no nail.
That's true. You're right. There is no
lingering
bomb.
on nothing. Absolutely nothing. And to me, that adds to the horror vibrancy of this film because its true antagonist is something that is omnipresent. And that I do find terrifying. So the fact that he's lingering on nothing suggests that, again, the spirituality of the film could show itself at any moment, but maybe not, because all we're seeing is nothing. So I do find that extremely thrilling here and effective in terms of creating an atmosphere that is foreboding without getting bogged down in an actual bomb that could go off at any moment. So I do find the filmmaking pretty brilliant. And then when the payoffs do come, they're handled with, well, as much subtlety as you probably can, given what it is. A movie doing.
Like this, yeah.
But it allows the audience to foreshadow and see those things coming before they do. So it's not acting as a conventional jump scare or anything to that effect either. So I like in terms of his direction, I don't think he overdoes it. I think he handles it with grace and perfection. The issue for me is the storytelling, and I don't see those things necessarily as mutually exclusive. I think the writing here, the characterization, that could have been handled without having to remove anything he does as a director. He could have emphasized the story a little bit better. He could have emphasized these characters, especially Lee, the Micah Monroe character, because there are storytelling blemishes here that, to your point, where I do agree with you, I don't think the film is able to fully realize these characters and how they function within the story. But for me, it had nothing to do with the direction as much as I just think he makes the wrong choices as a storyteller.
Well, and that might go back to something we were almost about to say earlier, and that is the synergy between storytelling and scare. What is he doing as a filmmaker that is complementary to the storytelling? And maybe that's why his direction was ultimately too effective for me, maybe a little bit distracting, because what's going on underneath is not serving the scare, if that makes sense. And maybe that's fair. Maybe that is ultimately the problem. So in the moment, while the movie was effective and I was affected by it, it did, leave a mark on me. I was very unnerved by it, but that's the thing I can only latch on to. That's all I had. So it's very easy to respond to the film in a certain way and think, I want to latch on to these. And you don't have to necessarily sympathize with these characters, but you at least have to have an invested interest in where they're going to go and what they're going to do. And because this movie is much louder as a directorial experience, it's easy to say that that's the reason why it's suffocating it. And I still think there are some things that Perkins is doing that might be over-directed, but I'm not going to sit here and say the script is not the problem, because there are things here from a narrative that are not even just derivative, but I just wonder what's going on thematically underneath that makes this film narratively any more interesting than other movies of its kind. And that's where I'm really torn on this, because I hate using the word empty, because I feel like that's a very cruel word for anything. I feel like all movies are at least about something. But I at the same time, I'm kind of hard pressed to say that about Longlegs. I'm not sure if it really has much to say, and if it does, I don't think it fully realizes it by the end and has sort of a half-baked version of what those ideas could ultimately be.
I mean, I do think it wants to be a movie about generational trauma. In fact, weirdly, the movie I thought about walking out of this, and you're never going to anticipate what I'm going to say here, Brennan. I saw this as an evil twin to Midnight Special.
Of course,
it's a lot like Midnight Special.
I feel like everything reminds you of Midnight Special nowadays.
I mean, it's about the idea that you love your kids so much that you're willing to do anything for them, to protect them, even if that means making a deal with Satan himself. Yeah. But that has these unforeseen consequences, because Lee is forced to reckon with, one, the toll that takes on those close to her, I'll say vaguely without getting into spoilers, and two, the burden it puts on her once she realizes the choices that are affecting her in the present that, again, I'll say vaguely relates to generational trauma. So what was supposed to be this gift, which we haven't really mentioned quite yet, Lee, as we see in these opening scenes, seemingly has this psychic ability where she instinctually can locate these serial killers. So what was supposed to be this gift has actually become this curse, and it's left her with no agency, which kind of leaves her stuck between these two worlds. But to your point, I'm not sure what the film really has to say about any of that. Is there commentary here about generational trauma? Does it tether to religion and faith in some sort of way? I feel like all of that gets lost. And maybe even
Mhm.
more frustrating to me is that there's this great ambiguity that even Lee doesn't know what to believe. She isn't sure what this ability is or where
Mhm.
it comes from. She doesn't have any religious ethos. She doesn't even seem to recoil at the idea that Satan is tangibly involved. The only
Mhm.
time she is repulsed is when Longlegs does what he does in the interview, I'll
Yeah.
say. But that's primarily because of the violence of it. The problem, I don't think the film does anything with that ambiguity. She begins as a blank slate, she ends as a blank slate. There's
Mhm.
not much in terms of creating or like fully realizing the canvas to articulate anything meaning out of
Well,
any idea
y-
that's brought up here. And
yeah.
that to me is the frustration, because as much as I love the direction and I admire the performances here quite a lot, I still think there was plenty of room as a storyteller to do something fascinating.
Mhm.
Like I think of something like Robert Eggers, for example, because he's a filmmaker that equally loves to bring this visceral, tangible direction to his movies.
Yeah.
And the Witch, for example, there's some great subtlety to it, obviously some unnerving authenticity to
Mhm.
it, but he's able to fully realize those characters
Yeah.
without over, you know, like he
Well,
doesn't expunge too much in terms of backstory. There's no exposition. Like you learn everything about those characters and their motives as the story
mhm.
goes, with all of that great vibrant direction in that film. And so like I think there's more than enough space here as a storyteller for him to delve into these themes, the spiritualism of it, how Longlegs is involved, why Longlegs is involved, what's motivating Lee, what is her agency here, or she has no agency, so let's explore that. Like I feel like there was more than enough space here, and I just don't think he takes advantage.
Well, with someone like Robert Eggers, while his films are very vibrant, might not be the right word, but they're very loudly directed in the right ways. But all of his films have these narrative and thematic ambiguities, but they still feel like they arrive at some kind of point, which
Yeah.
allows you to, maybe start to compartmentalize some of its individual themes or find some way that they actually are synchronizing with each other. All of his films are able to do that. The best filmmakers, and regardless of genre, are able to do that. And I think
And well,
that's the
and
problem
and
with
and The
yeah,
Witch especially, you think
yeah,
about its ideas of faith and Black
hmm
Phillip as this demonic presence. It isn't too dissimilar from Longlegs in that regard.
hmm
When you're talking about a lot of direction and similar-ish ideas and marrying those together, The
hmm
Witch is an astounding work of art. It's fantastic.
It's one of the best
So
films of
like
the 2010s.
exactly.
Yeah.
So like I don't know how long of a leg this film has to stand on
Nice
when
work. Nice work.
it's working within a
It's
similar-ish
it's a
formula,
very
but
weak
fails to
kickstand. It's about
realize.
to fall over.
Exactly. It needed longer legs.
Well, but yeah, it's like and going back to Robert Eggers and how I said that all of his films, you could tell they're arriving at some kind of thematic point. You don't have to agree on what that point is. That's the beauty of ambiguity. I mean, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, no one agrees upon how that movie ends. Yet it feels like it's arriving at some type of finality, at some type of
Yeah.
thematic conclusion. It's more about how you can sense that there's something to be said here. What is it? And I think that's what's missing here with Longlegs, because you
Yeah.
have these dangling threads, these dangling thematic ideas, and I don't think they conclude in a way that makes you try to piece them together. These ideas on autonomy, as you're talking about, on religious faith and fanaticism, that's certainly here. The idea of overprotective parents in a
Again, the
place.
midnight special of it all. I kind
Yeah.
of joke, but that's more or less what it is. But the film doesn't really do anything with it.
No,
And
no.
by the time we even learn that, we're literally at the end of the movie.
Yeah, the idea of how sense of place has a part in this story as well. The setting, I think, is very much a character here. This takes place in Oregon, if I'm not mistaken, but it feels very isolated and cold, quite literally. It's very off the beaten path. You might guess that this town's population is like 5 or something like that. And I think that idea is really interesting as well, that something so torturous and horrific can happen even in the smallest of places. So
Yeah.
it actually like lessens the pool of who this could actually involve. I think that's a scary idea. And these are all interesting ideas, but by the end, I found no through line. And that's not to say they have to
Yeah.
have a through line that neatly ties everything up, but I don't feel like the film is arriving at any type of perceived point that makes you want to find out what it means to you.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that frustrated me as well.
I agree. And I think that's where Osgood Perkins, the storyteller, does get lost here. As much as I love his direction here, the narrative and its ideas seemingly overwhelm him. I know he's talked about in interviews that idea of generational trauma when you look at his father, who famously lived a sheltered and closeted life until he died of AIDS in the early 90s. His mother is unfortunately killed during 9/11. She was on that first plane that hit the tower.
Yeah.
So generational trauma is certainly something that is a significant part of his life. And he's also talked about what's terrifying to him about the idea of the devil is that he's not out to conquer the world. He seemingly infiltrates, these little communities. To your point, it's I'm going to come after this priest or this little family or this little pocket over here, and it doesn't always come out in these large, vast communities. Sometimes it does. We talked about that a little bit with Maxine and the serial killer there in Los Angeles, but sometimes it's also in these small little communities, and that's how the devil can operate. Is no one is safe from that kind of evil. And you're right, that does add a sense of terror and dread to this film. But when you're trying to weave all of these ideas together, it just makes for a jumbled mess. I mean, earlier we mentioned that Lee has this special ability that is dropped after about the 30-minute mark. We never go back to that. Like
we get a potential answer by the end as to where it maybe came from, but even there, it's not fully developed or confirmed for us, I guess. But we can at least infer that. But as far as how it serves the story, you're right. It's basically dropped. It's basically a character trait that is completely ignored for the rest of its runtime.
It's completely ignored. And even if you're able to infer where that does come from, and I think the film gives us enough that we can infer, why is that not then a significant part of the ending of this film?
Or even a
when
part of
it
her
does come
investigation.
full circle. Yeah, exactly. Well, and I guess that circles back to the synopsis that I mentioned earlier, which I find a little funny because
Yeah. Now I
in
get it.
pursuit of a serial killer, an FBI agent uncovers a series of occult clues that she must solve to end this terrifying killing spree. She solves all those clues at like the 35-minute mark,
I know it's hilarious.
which I kind of admire. It's very different than something like Zodiac, I guess, in that regard. But, well, and I guess to that point, that's ultimately why this movie is nothing like Zodiac in the end. It's nothing like Seven in the end, or even Silence of the Lambs, because
It has ciphers. That's how it's similar to Zodiac.
yes, like the procedural element of this film is a facade, or it's a cipher for Lee to eventually find herself in a more spiritual, horror, supernatural narrative.
Yeah.
that completely distances. It's like this film has more in common with The First Omen or The Omen than it does any of those police procedurals. Like on
Sure.
the surface, that it kind of maintains that facade, but this is more of an occult, Satanist, spiritual story where the devil is tangibly involved, like he directly on screen. Like there's no subtlety about it either by the end.
No.
And
It actually does. You're right. It does give you that as a literal presence, which in a way I
yes,
kind of admire. But at the same time, it does make me wonder, what's the point? You know,
yeah,
and I hate bringing that up as a question because sometimes that's a fair question to ask that makes a movie more fascinating. But here, I think it's an example of a movie stumbling over its many ambitious
yeah,
ideas and not finding that fruition between them.
yeah. The man can't be downstairs if he's not downstairs anymore. But he's not
I
downstairs.
mean, that's the thing. He
Now
spends most of his time upstairs.
he spends most exactly. Uh
Should we talk about
yeah.
Nicolas Cage in that
Well,
regard?
and so and that's another thing. Like as much as you can admire Nicolas Cage's performance here, the character itself, I do think, is equally problematic because I don't know what he offers here that crystallizes or helps tether these loose threads together that we've been talking about. It just adds another hurdle for this film as far as trying to tie everything together. And it struggles mightily. It
Yeah.
struggles mightily in that regard. But if we're simply going to talk about Cage's performance in a vacuum on its own terms,
I think it's effective. I think it's effective.
it's nightmare fuel. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, and I like how the film weirdly keeps him off screen even when he's on screen. It's actually a really smart tactic, and there are times when you actually clearly see Nicolas Cage on screen. If I'm being honest, I might not have even been able to tell that was Nicolas Cage, even if I saw him clear as day in this movie. Maybe that's also really great makeup work that's doing a lot of the work for us.
Yes.
But he does take a little bit of a back seat. He's doing a lot of his usual cageisms, if you want to call it that, but they are weirdly kind of reserved when you compare it to some other films that he has done in the past, which I do admire. But yeah, to your point, if anything prevents this from being one of Nicolas Cage's best roles, it's the movie not properly serving his performance.
Yeah.
And I think that's
And
the
that's
big
it.
problem.
Yeah.
And that's why even among the more
Yeah.
recent Nicolas Cage outings that do find a place in horror, or at least horror adjacent, I would much take a performance like Mandy over this, but I think that's a movie that utilizes him more
time.
fairly. You know, yeah. It's
It's not Cage's fault by any stretch of the imagination. I think he is very, very good here. Ironically, Osgood Perkins has talked about the reason his screen time is limited is, he thought of something like John Doe from Seven. Maybe that's where this film has the most comparisons to Seven.
It's funny you say that, because if there was one slight knock I would give to Longlegs as far as how it reminded me of another film, there were elements of Cage's performance that reminded me of Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. And I guess that's even another example that maybe you can draw to that. Kind of the John Doe side of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand wanting to limit him from that perspective because those performances, those characters it do resonate over time and can be very effective even if they're not on screen all that much. And I do think you can add this to the canon. Cage's performance is extremely unnerving. The makeup work certainly doing some of the lifting. The score does some of the lifting. Also the framing. The box ratio in those opening sequences, I think, are clever. It works as like this projector you would have at home to watch home movies. So it has this tight frame that is from the perspective of a child. So the camera is at a very low angle.
It's very clearly hiding his eyes.
Hiding much of
what
Longlegs'
makes him
face.
pretty chilling.
Yeah, so we only get a small glimpse, and it is terrifying in that regard. And even the other instances throughout the film where we do see him, it's not often you get a full expression of his face. The blurred or hidden, even that convenience store scene, he's covering his face with his hands there.
Yeah.
We mostly get him at his fullest in that interview sequence later on in the film. And that's how the film wanted to build up the character. And I think Cage is extremely, extremely effective, terrifying in his performance here. The issue with the character is not Cage. It is how the film uses
I agree.
him within the context of the story. And there's just too much happening around Longlegs for the character to make any significant difference.
Well, I feel like you can say that about nearly every performance and every character in this movie, is that the movie itself undersells each of their respective abilities in some ways. Because I think there are some standout performances here. Cage is certainly one of them. And I mentioned earlier, I like a lot of what Micah Monroe is doing. I was really trying to latch on to her performance and what she was giving us, because there's a tender insecurity about her. But there are things that just kept underselling my ability from getting to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, as many people have been calling out on Twitter already, Alicia Witt's performance, which...
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I feel like if there's any performance here in the movie that maybe is best served by the movie itself, it might be hers. And that's primarily because she more or less becomes the main character by the third act. So the movie has no choice but to serve what happens to her. And I don't want to give too much away as far as spoilers, but I think when the movie makes that transition, she sells it very well. But I feel like that's maybe the moment when there is something complementary happening here between performance and story. And sadly, it's too little too late, but there was something there as far as her performance working in conjunction with the movie.
Well, and it says something about her performance, because that reveal is absurd.
It's myopic as heck. Like you can kind of see it coming from a mile away.
Well, it's not even just the reveal. Let me be clear. It's not the reveal itself and what it means to this story. I like the idea on paper because, again, it circles back to generational trauma. It's the evil twin to Midnight Special. That's the factor that we're talking about here. Yeah. The issue is the reveal comes in this excruciatingly tedious exposition dump late in the film.
Well,
why are you throwing in this incredibly misguided exposition dump so late in the film to just tell us everything that's happening here? And then everything that follows is pretty much plot. Because after that's how the film ends.
That exposition dump comes at the moment that Lee Harker remembers her past. Because there's a clear action that Alicia Witt takes that seems to suggest, I've been hiding this from you, but now I did this action. It involved holding a shotgun, I'll simply say. Now you're able to remember what I've been hiding from you. And I think that's why the exposition dump comes. So I think I can justify it from a character standpoint, but I do agree with you as far as the editing of it, the flow of it is awkward. It does feel convenient as far as how it flows within the context of a movie. But I understand why a character like Lee Harker in that moment finally knows what's up as we do. So it's less of a
plot. We're talking about plot. Sure. And that's my issue with how all of that unravels at the end of the film, is that it all circles back to plotting. I agree it makes sense, but it's too plot driven, and the exposition framing is it's bad editing and bad storytelling.
That's fair. The editing's
and
the
it
problem.
removes ambiguity, because this is a film that features these haunted dolls. Lee has this psychic ability. There's a serial killer on the loose. Satan is tangibly involved in all of this, and that exposition framing explains how everything is tethered together. It removes the nightmare factor and gives you clarity. And that I thought was a wrongly calculated decision. Like I thought that completely took me out of the movie.
I think I would have been able to be more on board with that if maybe the movie itself was a little bit less self-serious, if that makes sense. There is a genuine sense of dread and, as you said earlier, trauma happening here. But I also think about, not to say that the movie needs to match the marketing. That's not the case. But very recently, given the movie's box office success, what did it say? Number one movie in America, only behind Despicable Me
Yeah,
4.
I love
Like,
that.
that's brilliant. That's very clever. That's very tongue-in-cheek. That's really silly. And the final act of this movie is, narratively speaking, very silly. And I kind of wish parts of the movie felt a little bit sillier, maybe to kind of match that energy. And
Maybe.
I don't know
Yeah.
if I don't think it does enough. Even Nicolas Cage here, I think in the wrong hands, he's giving a performance that could come off as very silly, but it never feels that way, which in a weird way is a compliment to his performance. But it also makes me wonder, would the movie have worked better for me if it was maybe a little bit more fun in a way?
Well, and I
think,
don't know if you can do that given its atmosphere.
Yeah, I don't
and
know.
How
I don't know.
much work the film did in creating that foreboding atmosphere to get silly and tongue in cheek. I don't think would work all that well. I mean, that would take a master craftsman, especially in terms of tone management, to make that work. I just don't know if that would be the right move here. And I'm okay with the film leaning into its self-seriousness. For me, the issue is the storytelling and the execution of it. I mean, giving us an exposition dump. Like there's ways to unveil that information and let it play out more organically, and allowing the character of Ruth to I guess expunge that without the film going to some sort of flashback. Like I don't think we need to get into that flashback, especially because the performance I think is good enough. And honestly,
To sell that realization. Yeah, I
I
think
feel
that's
like
fair.
the movie had foreshadowed her involvement, and ultimately what we learned. I don't know if it's all that surprising because the film had
The movie is not
suggested
surprising.
that
No.
that she was involved in some sort of way. So like it makes it doubly worse when you're explaining everything through this really bad exposition dump, and also it gives us nothing new that we didn't know before.
The opening of the movie kind of tells us the answer, right?
Yes,
I
would say so.
Yeah, without directly telling you, it gives you enough clues to suggest how the opening here, before that title card even drops, how that opening connects to our main character. There's enough there to infer that what ends up happening at the end is, put it this way, if it's meant to surprise you, then the movie ultimately fails big time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. So like my whole issue with this film is Osgood Perkins, the storyteller. Like it has some good ideas fundamentally. You have a fantastic antagonist. Really, you have two of them that are driving much of the menacing tone to this film. And it really comes through wonderfully in the direction. Micah Monroe is great in this film. Blair Underwood, who we haven't talked about very much, is great here as well.
He's great. Yeah, he's really good.
I really love these performances, and even the police procedural of it all, which I think is quite muted. I don't think it's nearly as big of an impact or an aspect of this story as others have made it out to be. There's enough here that I find extremely compelling, which is ultimately why, going back to my opening thoughts, despite my frustrations, I was won over by the film because there are some really good things here that I do admire. But because those things are great, this film had the potential to be one of those great horror films, especially of this decade so far. But it doesn't quite get there because the storytelling is all over the place and there's no purpose to it.
Have you seen any of Osgood Perkins' other films as a filmmaker yet?
Yeah. I saw The Black Coat's Daughter the year it came out. In fact, if memory serves, it was the last movie I caught up with right before we did our year-end award show
interesting.
that year.
Okay. I remember
Fairly certain.
I remember
is
that
the
movie.
case.
I remember that movie not working for me at all. I'd have to give that a
Mhm.
revisit. Maybe I was just in the wrong frame of mind for it. But while I will say, and I'll still stand by what I said in my opening thoughts, that between the 3 films of his that I have seen, I don't I don't know if he's ever going to be one of my guys, if these are the movies we're going to keep getting. Even with that said, I think Longlegs is the strongest of his films I have seen yet. And I think it's primarily
Yeah.
because it genuinely felt evil. Like it felt
Mhm.
like it came from an
Yeah.
evil mind, and that's not an easy thing to pull off without it feeling like overly silly. And I think for the most part, that idea is maintained throughout its runtime, and I will give him credit for that, for at least having that attribute.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. I like my instinct with Osgood Perkins. I haven't seen Gretel and Hansel though, so I don't really know. But my
Mhm.
instinct was, well, maybe if he removes himself from the screenwriting equation, maybe
Mhm.
he would be more effective as a director from that perspective. I know I used to talk that way about M. Night for quite a while. I
It's
think
something we've come to respect about him
I've come to
now.
respect. My opinion has shifted because the evidence has circulated and
Yeah.
has come back around to him. Again, I haven't seen Gretel and Hansel. That was written by Rob Hayes. The other
Mhm.
films of his, he's written.
Yeah.
And it seems like to me, Osgood Perkins, the writer, can't keep up with Osgood Perkins, the filmmaker. I would
That's a
love
fair
to
way to say it.
see him take a screenplay that, like a really good screenplay from someone else, and just let him go to town.
Yeah.
I would love to see that because I think that might be the recipe for him to do something really special.
Yeah, or maybe some type of other adaptation where the core
Yeah.
of the story is ultimately there, and he at least has a blueprint or a framework to stick within. Um,
Mhm.
uh, but but you're right. I think he needs to be boxed in a little bit more as a storyteller for sure,
Yeah.
and allow that synergy between story and scare to
Yeah.
really work. And I do think ultimately with Longlegs there is a bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, yeah, because I do really love his direction, and not just the atmosphere of this film and how foreboding it is, and the cinematography is excellent here.
Mhm.
I love the experimentation of the box ratio, how that expands throughout the film. The sound design, the constant ambient noises that we hear throughout the film is
Mhm.
also really great. Um, like as a director, I think he comes to play and it is fantastic, especially as a
Sure.
theatrical experience. Man, I was completely bought in to his experimentation here. I just wish there was a story and a screenplay that can match it.
Hone it in. Just gotta hone it in.
Gotta hone it in. Do you have any final thoughts here?
I will agree aesthetically, there are some good things here, especially the cinematography and some of the musical choices here as well. The soundtrack is really interesting. I wanted to get a lot more insight into uh Longlegs himself and his fascination with 1970s glam rock. There are a lot of references to bands like T-Rex in this, and I thought that was really a nice touch.
Yeah.
So I like what the film is doing aesthetically in that regard. I'm still not sure if Perkins, the director, really works for me ultimately. Sometimes I still find it a little bit over directed, but per this conversation, is that a result of just the script being underwritten that makes it feel over directed?
I think
And that
it's
could
that
be
more than
and,
anything.
and that could be the case. So we'll see if he's able to find any synergy with his next project because I think he has the potential to make a great film, or at least a film that
Mhm.
I see to be great. I haven't seen it just yet, but I admire what he goes for.
I agree. I think that's ultimately where I land here. Um, yeah, just this is a film that has a lot on its mind, but doesn't know what to say, and
Yeah,
certainly there's no conviction to it. So, in a lot of ways, I land on this similarly to where I did with Maxine. But ultimately, I think I like this film more than Maxine, though. Like I love what it's going for.
yeah.
I love the experience that it evokes aesthetically anyway. I love Nicolas Cage here is going to be memorable.
Sure.
In all the great ways. Again, I just wish that the story served him better, but I still find him extremely unnerving and memorable. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a film I'm going to be willing to give another shot at some point down the road.
We'll see if it has legs.
We'll see if it has legs. Yeah, who knows? But anyway, that's where we sit right now with Longlegs. Ultimately, perhaps disappointing, but not because of the marketing, but because I think there was greatness here.
Yeah,
that just kind of fell apart.
Mixed to positive is probably the best way I could describe myself on it.
Okay, there we go. All right, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Letterboxd as well. We would love to hear from you. Yeah, that'll do it. So
yeah,
stay tuned for the main show. We're going to be talking about some films that we caught up with, some 2024 releases that we caught up with, but we haven't done a review for. So we're going to be talking about those, and I'm sure we'll talk a little further about Longlegs and its box office haul. Because, my goodness, it was quite something.
There's a story there.
Absolutely. With that said, Brennan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I just got to say I'm so disappointed in myself that we went this whole review, JD, and I didn't call you Daddy Longlegs.
No, we don't need to get into any sort of Daddy Longlegs conversation. Maybe we can save that for another time. But no, I guess my last thought on here, even though we didn't talk about her too much, but Micah Monroe, great to see her back.
Yeah.
I love seeing her on screen, and I'm not sure the last thing that I saw her in. It's been a while.
Was it Villains?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to look. Honey Boy, maybe was the last thing I saw her in.
Oh yeah, she was in that, wasn't she?
That might have been the last thing I've seen her in.
Wow,
yeah, it's been a while. So I'm great to, very excited to see her come back.
Talented
to
actress,
something like
very
this.
talented.
Yeah, she's really great here. I think she does a fantastic job, and I look forward to seeing her in They Follow, which hopefully will come out next year. Who knows? I'm not sure where they're at with that project, but
yeah, I don't know if that's landed yet, but I know it's definitely coming. It's following. It's definitely following us.
Yeah, she's very good here. And then I also want to shout out Kiernan Shipka, who we didn't talk too much about in the conversation as well, but she has a very memorable scene as well. Only one scene, but again, a striking performance. These actors are not the problem here. They're really great.
Yeah.
They take advantage and probably even over materialize their characters than what's on the page. I think they're that good. They bring something out that might not be there in terms of the writing and the storytelling, which just makes the ultimate, decision making in terms of the story here all the more frustrating in the end. But
well, it makes sense that she's here because she was also in The Black Coat's Daughter, so it's nice to bring a little tie in there. But yeah, in a way, now that you bring her up, maybe she actually gives the best performance in the movie because she's only in one scene.
Only in one scene, but very effective. It's fantastic. And I look forward to more nightmares thanks to Nicolas Cage's performance here.
Just the cuckoo.
Oh my God.
Cuckoo.
It is. Wow. It is a stunner of a perforence.
I will say the way that scene in the drugstore crystallizes, one of the funniest moments of the film.
It's good. It's really good. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. At any rate, hope you enjoyed Longlegs. Maybe you enjoyed it more than us, and that's perfectly fine. I hope you did. So, with all of that said, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Longlegs.
Those legs
had so much potential.
Such a bad kickstand.